Do you know that ancient mariners may have reached the shores of the Gold Coast long before European explorers set sail? Journey back in time as we explore the incredible story of Phoenician sailors who, over 2,500 years ago, embarked on daring voyages along the West African coast. Legend has it that these fearless navigators, driven by the allure of gold, discovered a secret land where they engaged in silent trade with the locals, exchanging goods without uttering a single word. But not all ended well. Some of these early explorers paid the ultimate price. Imagine a sailor determined to uncover the Gold Coast's riches, mysteriously losing his life in these treacherous waters. What secrets did they discover? And why was their silent trade so dangerous? Join us as we unravel the mysteries of these ancient explorers and their perilous encounters with the unknown. Whether the Gold Coast was known to the ancients remains uncertain, as it is challenging to provide a definitive answer today. However, some evidence suggests that it may have been recognized. The Phoenicians, among the earliest renowned navigators, made significant voyages. But since none of their writings have survived, the full scope of their explorations is unclear. Their secretive nature regarding navigation and trade, treated as state secrets, meant that much of their knowledge was lost when Tyre fell to Alexander and Carthage to Rome. We do know that the Phoenicians frequently sailed the Mediterranean, ventured along the Atlantic coast of Africa, and established colonies on the African coast beyond the Straits of Gibraltar between 1200 and 800 BC. Such colonization would likely only have been undertaken after they had gained substantial familiarity with those seas and coasts. Given that the Phoenicians regularly sailed down Africa's western coast, the main question is how far their voyages extended. Herodotus mentions 2 passages that suggest the possibility of them reaching the Gold Coast or nearby areas. He describes a Carthaginian account of a region in Libya, Africa, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Jebel Zatut and Gibraltar, where traders would land, deposit goods on the shore, and create a smoke signal to attract the attention of the natives. The natives would then exchange gold for the goods, with the traders either accepting the amount offered or waiting for more. A similar trading method is noted by 2 other writers. In 1455, Aloise de Cadamosto, a Venetian, heard about the high profits made by the Portuguese in the African trade under Prince Henry the Navigator, with returns of 700 to 1,000%. Motivated by this, he decided to sail down the west coast of Africa, agreeing to give a portion of his profits to Prince Henry. When he arrived near Cape Blanco at a place called Hoden, he learned about a town or region named Tragazza, located 6 days' journey from Hoden. Tragazza was involved in a salt trade that extended via caravans to Timbuktu and then to Meli. The continuation of the salt trade mentioned earlier provides further insights into the ancient trading practices of West Africa. After leaving the salt in heaps by the riverbank, the original traders would retreat a half-day's journey away. At this point, another group of traders, who avoided direct interaction and possibly arrived by boat from nearby islands, would approach the salt. These traders would assess the quality of the salt and leave a quantity of gold beside each heap. Once they withdrew, the original merchants would return to evaluate the gold. If the amount met their expectations, they would take the gold and leave the salt behind. However, if the gold was insufficient, they would leave it and retreat again. The process would continue until a satisfactory exchange was made. This silent trade method, attested by Arab and Azanagi merchants, was ancient and well established, lending credibility to the accounts from the period. Captain Richard Jobson during his 1622-21 voyage to the River Gambia, aimed to uncover more about this gold trade referenced by Cadamosto. Although Jobson mentioned the silent trade in his 1623 account, he appeared to be relying on secondary sources rather than first-hand experience, as he could not recall the specific authors he was referencing. Claude Jannequin, Sieur de Roquefort, who travelled to West Africa in 1637, also noted the existence of this silent trade near Cape Blanco. These accounts from Jobson and Jannequin further corroborate Herodotus's description of the Phoenicians' trading methods, particularly the use of gold as currency. While this evidence suggests that the Phoenicians engaged in similar trading practices, it does not necessarily imply that they reached as far as the Gold Coast. However, a variant of this silent trade was prevalent along the West African coast, extending even beyond the Gold Coast to modern times. The second passage from Herodotus carries even more significance. Around 600 BC, Pharaoh Necho, the ruler of Egypt, sought to create a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea. However, the project was abandoned after the death of a large number of laborers, leading Necho to explore alternative methods for connecting the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. He commissioned Phoenician sailors to embark on a voyage from the Red Sea, instructing them to navigate around the African continent and return to Egypt via the Mediterranean, passing through the Straits of Gibraltar. The Phoenicians embarked on this ambitious journey, sailing southward along the African coast. As autumn approached, they landed and established a temporary settlement where they sowed crops and awaited the harvest. According to Herodotus, this practice of pausing to cultivate food during lengthy voyages was customary among sailors on African expeditions. After spending 2 years on this endeavor, they eventually rounded the Pillars of Hercules, modern-day Strait of Gibraltar, and returned to Egypt in the 3rd year of their voyage. This remarkable expedition, if accurate, would have involved the Phoenicians circumnavigating Africa long before such feats were commonly attributed to European explorers. The account underscores the Phoenicians' advanced navigational skills and their ability to undertake prolonged and complex voyages. It also suggests that ancient maritime knowledge and trade networks extended further than often recognized, possibly even to the Gold Coast or its vicinity, reinforcing the idea that these regions were not entirely isolated from the wider ancient world. The account mentioned in Herodotus, where the sailors claim to have had the sun on their right hand while circumnavigating Africa, initially struck him as implausible. Herodotus understood that Africa was surrounded by the sea except at Suez, but the idea of the sun being to the north, as the sailors described, seemed too outlandish to be credible. However, as a diligent historian, Herodotus included this detail in his writings, recognizing its potential value even if he was skeptical. This inclusion is fortunate, as it provides compelling evidence that the circumnavigation of Africa was indeed achieved. If the story were entirely fabricated by the Phoenicians to cover up a failed expedition, it is unlikely they would have concocted such an extraordinary claim, especially one so contrary to the contemporary understanding of geography. Moreover, given the severe repercussions for those holding unconventional views in ancient times, often leading to execution, it seems improbable that the sailors would have risked sharing this account unless they genuinely believed in its truth. This detail strongly supports the authenticity of their journey, suggesting that they truly did navigate around the Cape of Good Hope, witnessing a phenomenon they could not fully comprehend but faithfully reported. The other details of the voyage are consistent with this interpretation. The duration of the trip, spanning 2 years, is reasonable, Considering the practices of ancient seafaring, the prevailing winds and currents would have favored a westward journey, making the circumnavigation feasible. The primary challenge would have been the harsh seas near the Cape of Good Hope, while modern sailors avoid these treacherous waters by steering southward. The Phoenicians, unfamiliar with these seas and adhering to a coastal route, would not have had this option. Despite this, it is plausible that starting with multiple ships, at least some would have successfully navigated through the rough waters. Furthermore, it is known that the Phoenicians regularly traded with the British Isles, which involved navigating the notoriously challenging Bay of Biscay, demonstrating their capability to handle difficult maritime conditions. Accepting the likelihood that this voyage occurred around 600 BC, it is conceivable that the Gold Coast was visited during this expedition. Given the small size of the ships and the limited knowledge of the seas at the time, the Phoenicians likely followed the coastline closely, rarely losing sight of land unless forced by storms. They would have needed to stop frequently to replenish water and provisions, making it plausible that they landed on the Gold Coast. Although landing on the Gold Coast is generally dangerous due to the treacherous surf, there are locations where it is relatively safe and accessible. The Phoenicians could have been assisted by the local inhabitants, who were skilled in navigating the surf with their canoes and could have facilitated the landing and departure of the sailors. While it is unlikely that the Phoenicians would have established a farm on the Gold Coast due to the extensive land clearing that would have been required, it remains possible that they discovered gold during a visit. This discovery could have laid the foundation for a more consistent trade, possibly contributing to the regular exchange that some evidence suggests existed later. Moreover, it is conceivable that other Phoenician explorers, whose journeys were not recorded, might have also visited the Gold Coast during their explorations of the West African coast. These visits could have further cemented the region's place in early trade networks, although no direct records of these expeditions have survived. At this point in history, the belief that Africa was a peninsula had become widely accepted, and the earlier theory proposed by Hipparchus, which posited that each sea was confined to its own separate basin, only gained traction after the memory of these early discoveries had faded. As a result, the fragmented accounts of Phoenician voyages that had once been taken seriously gradually fell into discredit. During the reign of Xerxes, Sataspes, a Persian noble and the nephew of Darius, was sentenced to death for a crime. His mother, however, persuaded Xerxes to commute the sentence on the condition that Sataspes would sail around Africa until he reached Arabia. Sataspes embarked on this journey, sailing past the Pillars of Hercules and the promontory of Solois, turning southward. According to Herodotus, after several months of navigating through an immense stretch of sea, Sataspes, seeing no end to his task, decided to turn back and return to Egypt. Upon his return, he claimed that the voyage was impossible to complete because his ship could not continue. Xerxes, unimpressed by this explanation, had the original sentence carried out, and Sataspes was crucified. Antonio Galvano, writing in the 16th century, dated this voyage to 485 BC and suggested that Sataspes might have reached the Cape of Good Hope, although the basis for this claim is unclear. It is plausible, however, that after several months at sea, Sataspes could have reached this point. The treacherous seas and strong currents around the Cape might well explain his report that his vessel was unable to proceed further. One of the most significant ancient voyages on record is that of the Carthaginian explorer Hanno. This expedition took place when Carthage was at the peak of its power, before the Battle of Himera in 480 BC. Though some historians date it as early as 1000 BC or even earlier. The account of Hanno's journey provides more detail than other ancient voyages, but it also leaves much room for speculation regarding its actual scope. The original record was written in Punic, but the version we have today is a Greek translation made at a much later date. This translation appears to be an abridged version, with many important details about time and distance either omitted or distorted. The dual purpose of Hanno's voyage was to establish colonies along the West African coast and to discover an alternative route to India. Hanno's fleet comprised 60 kinkarems, large galleys with 2 masts and 5 banks of oars. The colonists on board, including many women, numbered 30,000, and the ships were heavily laden with provisions and other supplies. The first colony was established 2 days' sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules and was named Thymaterium, which has been identified with Azamor on the banks of the river Marmora. Continuing his journey, Hanno reached a promontory called Solois, believed to be Cape Cantin, where he built a temple to Neptune. Sailing another 1.5 days beyond this cape, he founded 5 more cities along the coast: Korykontikos, Gita, Accra, Melita, and Arambais. Hanno then encountered a river called the Lixus, where he found a race of herdsmen and stayed long enough to develop a friendly relationship with them. Although the time taken to reach the Lixus is not recorded, it is generally believed to be either the Ouro or the St. Cyprian River. Hanno took some of these friendly Lixitai as interpreters and sailed 2 days south and 1 day east, discovering an island in a deep bay, which he colonized and named Cerne. He noted that the distance from the Pillars of Hercules to Carthage and to this island seemed about equal. It is likely that he had doubled Cape Blanco and reached the island now known as Arguin, a theory supported by the discovery of ancient tanks or cisterns on Arguin, likely constructed by these Phoenician colonists. Hanno then sailed farther south and encountered another river, the Cretes, which opened into a large lake containing several islands. 1 day's sail beyond the mouth of this river, he found some mountains, and further south, another large river teeming with crocodiles and hippopotamus. This description aligns with the rivers Senegal and Gambia, the Senegal having a large lagoon with islands, and the Gambia being known for its crocodiles and hippopotamus. The mountains, mentioned located 1 day's sail beyond the Cretes, would correspond to the hills around Cape Verde, which, though not very high, are notable on a coast that is otherwise mostly flat. After reaching the mouth of the Gambia, Hanno returned to Cerne for a time before continuing his voyage southward. It is during this latter part of the journey that identifying the localities becomes particularly challenging, and there is the greatest reason to suspect errors or omissions in the Greek translation. The Periplus, the account of Hanno's voyage, describes this second portion of the journey as follows. Hanno sailed south for 12 days, staying close to the coast, which was inhabited by Negroes who fled upon seeing the fleet. The Lixite interpreters could not understand their language. On the last day, the fleet arrived at a mountain covered with large, fragrant trees of various colors. After 2 more days of coasting by this mountain, Hanno encountered a deep and turbulent sea near a plain where fires were seen at night, scattered across the landscape. After taking on water, they sailed 5 more days to reach a large bay, which the interpreters called Hesperus's Horn. Within this bay was a great island, which contained a lake that appeared to be a sea, and within that lake was another island. Upon landing, the explorers saw nothing but woods by day, but at night they heard the sounds of fifes, cymbals, drums, and countless shouts, filling them with fear. Their diviners advised them to leave the island, and they swiftly departed. As they continued their voyage, they passed by a country that emitted a fragrant aroma, with fiery rivers flowing into the sea. The land was so hot that it was uninhabitable. Afraid, they hoisted their sails and sailed for 4 days, during which they saw the land aflame, with one especially tall fire reaching up to the stars. By day, they identified this as a very high mountain, which they named the Chariot of the Gods. After 3 more days of sailing by fiery rivers, they arrived at a gulf called Notuceras, meaning the South Horn. In the inner part of this gulf was a small island with a lake, and within that lake was another island inhabited by savage men, whom their interpreters called Gorgones, or gorillas. The explorers pursued the men but could not capture any, as they fled to precipices and defended themselves with stones. However, they did capture 3 women, who bit and scratched those who attempted to lead them away. The women were eventually killed, skinned, and their hides were brought back to Carthage. Due to a lack of provisions, the expedition did not continue further south. The second portion of Hanno's voyage is challenging to define precisely, with varying estimates of its extent and the identification of the western and southern horns. Different commentators have proposed various locations for these landmarks. D'Anville suggested Cape Roxo as the western horn and Cape St. Anne or Sherbro Sound as the southern horn. Monsieur de Bougainville, however, placed Cape Palmas as the western horn and Cape 3 Points as the southern horn, while Major Rennell believed that Sherbro Island was the island of the gorillas, thereby limiting the voyage to the region of Sierra Leone. Despite the mountains in Sierra Leone, which reach heights of around 2,600 feet, they've been identified as non-volcanic, casting doubt on this theory. Other scholars believe that Hanno might have reached as far as the Gabon and Congo, with some geographers even suggesting that he never ventured beyond the Moroccan coast, or that he possibly reached the Cape of Good Hope. However, those most familiar with the West African coast tend to believe that Hanno reached the Cameroons, even if he did not go further. Beyond the difficulties of estimating time, there's also the challenge of interpreting what Hanno himself meant by certain terms. The word horn has caused confusion, as some commentators have restricted its meaning to promontories, whereas the Greek term keros was more commonly used to refer to arms of the sea. A passage from Hampton's translation of Polybius illustrates this usage, describing a current in the Bosphorus that flows into a pool called the Horn. The islands mentioned in the Great Bay at the Western Horn might have been low-lying alluvial tracts that could have significantly changed over time, possibly even merging with the mainland. However, the island of the gorillas seems to have been more permanent, with features like precipices that are not typically found on alluvial islands. Another question is whether the Gorgones mentioned in the Periplus were indeed gorillas, or rather baboons, chimpanzees, or another large species of ape. When the modern gorilla was discovered in 1846, it was named after the creatures described by Hanno. The behavior of the males fleeing up the mountains and throwing stones is reminiscent of baboons, whose females would also bite and scratch their captors, making them more likely to have been caught than true gorillas. Capturing 3 live, possibly full-grown gorillas would have been an extraordinary and dangerous task, even today. Even if these animals were gorillas, their geographic range may have shifted over the centuries. Historical accounts show that African animals, such as elephants, were once common in regions where they are now absent. For instance, around 1700, Bosman reported abundant wildlife near Takoradi and Sekondi, including elephants that were regularly killed around Axim and Accra. The distribution of gorillas could have similarly changed over the past 2,000 to 3,000 years. However, it is more likely that the Gorgones were baboons or chimpanzees. The rate at which ships of that era travelled must also be considered. Rennell, in his Geography of Herodotus, provided examples of the sailing speed of the best constructed ships of the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Egyptians. On average, a day's sail covered about 37 miles, though this would have varied depending on winds and currents. Hanno's fleet would have had to regulate its speed according to the slowest vessel, making it difficult to draw precise conclusions from time alone. Additionally, there is uncertainty about whether the times recorded in the periplus are accurate or complete. Therefore, while times cannot be entirely disregarded, they should not be overly relied upon to determine specific locations. Given the uncertainties surrounding the meaning of horn, the identification of the Gorgonese, and the times recorded, it is more reliable to focus on the physical features mentioned in the account, particularly the mountain of fire, the island with precipices inhabited by apes, and either promontories or gulfs that correspond to the descriptions of the western and southern horns. Taking Kerne as Arguin, a well-supported identification, the Carthaginians, having explored the coast as far as the Gambia, set out from Kerne and sailed south, passing a region inhabited by Negroes whose language the Lixitai interpreters could not understand. This indicates that they had travelled south of the river Senegal, which marks the northern limit of true Negro populations. Hanno's mention of tree-covered mountains likely refers again to Cape Verde, a prominent and verdant landmark noted by early voyagers like Villot in 1666 and Golbery in 1785. After passing the Gambia, Hanno would not have mentioned it again, and the troublesome race of the sea could be the mouth of the Rio Grande. When the Carthaginians reached the Great Bay called the Western Horn, where they encountered drumming, shouting and fires at night, it likely refers to the harbour of Sierra Leone, which fits the description of a bay containing low-lying alluvial islands. The fires might have been those set by natives clearing land or lighting their evening dances, while the drumming and shouting are common features of African village life. The fiery rivers and the mountain of fire described in the account could have been interpreted as either rivers with bad bars or the visual effect of burning grass along riverbanks during the dry season. The mountain of fire, seen after 4 days of sailing, likely refers to the Cameroon's Peak, an active volcano that could have appeared terrifying during an eruption. The Southern Horn, containing the island of the Gorgones, might correspond to Corisco Island, which fits the description better than Fernando Po. The absence of evidence that Hanno landed on the Gold Coast does not diminish the importance of his voyage. It demonstrates the Phoenicians' enterprising spirit and their serious interest in West Africa. After such a significant expedition, it is likely that they would have continued exploring and trading, possibly exchanging gold and ivory for their goods. Although no further records of these voyages survive, it is reasonable to believe that they took place. Additional evidence supporting ancient trade with the Gold Coast comes from the presence of peculiar beads known as agri-beads, found in the western part of the colony, where the best-known gold-producing districts are located. These beads, highly valued and difficult to counterfeit, are similar to those found in North Africa, Thebes, and India, regions where the Phoenicians traded. The remains of antique bronze lamps found in old gold workings also suggest a connection with Phoenician traders. Around 117 BC, a Greek named Eudoxus of Cyzicus sailed from Egypt to India. On his return, he was blown off course and ended up on the East African coast, where he discovered the wreckage of a ship with a horse figurehead, which he later identified as belonging to a Cadiz fishing fleet known to fish along the West African coast. This discovery led Eudoxus to believe that it was possible to circumnavigate Africa, prompting him to attempt the journey from the west coast. Although his first attempt was thwarted by crew mutiny, and he never returned from his second attempt, his discovery suggests that West African waters were known to ancient seafarers. While there is no definitive proof of trade between the Phoenicians and the Gold Coast, several pieces of evidence suggest that such contact might have existed. As we reflect on the incredible voyages of the Phoenicians, it becomes clear that their exploratory spirit may have led them to the very shores of the Gold Coast, long before more widely recognized explorers. Their encounters with the land, the people, and the precious gold they sought to trade reveal a rich and complex history, filled with daring exploits and untold stories. Although the evidence is circumstantial, the beads, artifacts, and historical accounts hint at a connection that shaped the course of ancient trade. This narrative, intertwined with mystery and speculation, paints a vivid picture of early interactions that laid the groundwork for the global trade routes that followed. While Africans were living in harmony, nurturing their lands and communities, there were groups of voyagers and sailors secretly plotting to steal their precious minerals and enslave their people. The Gold Coast, rich with resources, became the target of these early explorers, whose ambitions would soon unleash a dark chapter in history. What started as a search for wealth turned into a devastating era of exploitation. To uncover more of these untold stories, make sure to watch our full video and subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more captivating insights into Africa's hidden history. And don't forget to share where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.